Welcome to our criterion referenced assessment application activity. In the next couple slides, you'll see an example of what we're kind of hoping for with this application activity. For the application activity, we would like you to take some time and review some of the standards and identify at least 2 standards that apply to the populations that you serve. If you only have time for one standard, that's totally okay. Copy and paste that standard into your learning log. Take a screenshot, use your snipping tool, whatever works best for you. Then reflect on those standards from that criterion reference lens. Think about what criterion reference tools do you have to assess student progress towards those standards. Reflect on that, briefly describe your tools, and think about how they support you in assessing student progress towards those standards. Or, once you have those standards picked out and you're trying to reflect on tools that you use, you might think that this is an area that maybe you're missing some tools in, that you don't have a lot of tools to really assess those standards that could be really important for students on your caseload. Reflect on that. Briefly describe what you feel might be helpful and assist you in assessing that student progress towards those standards. And as you're working through this reflection, consider multiple lenses. We know that not all of you do a lot of assessments, so think about your role and try to think about this activity from multiple perspectives, whether it's initial evaluations, re-evaluations, or even that IEP lens. If you don't do as many evaluations, you can view this from that IEP perspective. Do what makes the most sense for you. If you are looking at it from that IEP lens, think about what could you do or what do you already do when you're preparing for those annual IEP meetings to really determine if your student is progressing towards, that 1 or 2 standard that you picked out to reflect upon. For our elementary-based SLPs, we recommend reviewing some of the academic standards.
For my example, I'm going to choose the English language arts and specifically the speaking and listening standards.
So if I'm choosing those speaking and listening standards, I'm going to go to that section in the PDF version of the standards. I'm going to review. You can see that there are 2 different areas, comprehension and collaboration, and then presentation of knowledge and ideas. Let's say that I have several students on my caseload working on speech sounds. So it makes sense for me to consider looking at the speaking and listening standards and specifically comprehension and collaboration. And as we can see, I kind of have the grade level standards from kindergarten through 2nd grade laid out, so you can kind of look across those grades. But that overarching idea is that we want them to be able to participate in collaborative conversations with diverse partners about things in the classroom in large and small groups. And so that's going to be kind of my guiding standard that I'm going to reflect on for my application activity. So if my criteria is to think about how my student is participating in those collaborative conversations in the classroom, one tool that I have that I often use to assess this standard is observations. Now, DPI has this great document out there with some different ideas to maybe make our observations a bit more systematic. And so one thing that I would do when I'm, observing some of my students for speech sounds and seeing how they're doing, whether it's from that initial evaluation perspective, re-evaluation, or IEP perspective, is I might go in once I've had a conversation with that teacher about when is a time that you have some small group or more participation, talking-based times in your classroom. And I might make some observations with frequency recording. So I'm going to maybe mark some tallies on my sticky note to see how many times did that student use their speech sound targets correctly. Or if it's in that context of an evaluation, what errors am I noticing and maybe how often are they occurring? Or maybe I'm going to do some interval recording. Maybe I'm going to mark down on my sticky note how often that student is participating and possibly recording another peer or 2 to make some comparisons to see, okay, how often is, a couple other students participating, how often is my student participating, and then having that follow-up conversation with the teacher about, is this pretty common? Is this typical for most students in your classroom? And how does the student that I'm specifically observing compare? So that's one way that I can assess how my student is progressing towards that standard of participating in those collaborative conversations. So in my learning log, I'm going to copy over that standard of participating in collaborative conversations, and then I'm going to journal a little bit about how I use systematic observations to assess that standard. And there I've completed one reflection on a standard and how I assess it. Another example for speech sounds. Let's say I have some students who have more phonological based needs. And so I notice that their reading is often impacted. And so I decide to go to the reading foundational skills, and I want to look at some of those phonological awareness standards. And let's say that I want to look at how could I assess that standard possibly for a first or second grader. As you can see, we want them to be able to demonstrate understanding of spoken words, syllables, and sounds, and it's very similar in second grade as well. But then if you look at kind of those A, B, C options or the A option under second grade, we get a little bit more detail about what that criteria might be for first grade versus second grade. So if I keep that phonological awareness standard, that criteria in my brain, and I'm trying to think about, okay, what tools do I have that I might use to assess that phonological awareness during an initial evaluation or re-evaluation with a student? One free tool that I've used in the past is the PAST, so that phonological awareness screening test. And it's freely available online, and this is kind of a quick, simple way that you can assess some of those phonological awareness skills. Another thing you might consider is if you have access to anything else, maybe something from your district. I know in my past district there was a couple different ways that teachers might assess phonological awareness. So I could either get that information from the teacher or I could access the different assessments that we had specifically related to phonological awareness. So again, this is just one example of a tool that I might use to assess how that student is progressing towards that standard. And then again, when I go to my learning log, I'm simply going to copy over that standard and I'm going to do some reflection about how I use the PAST to assess how a student might be progressing towards that phonological awareness standard. Let's say that I have a lot of students on my caseload that have language needs. So I'm going to go to those speaking and listening standards again, and I'm going to look at comprehension and collaboration, as well as maybe that presentation of knowledge and ideas, just to kind of see what those expectations are. So if we ground ourselves in, let's say, first grade, we can see for comprehension and collaboration, they should be able to ask and answer questions about details in a text read aloud or information presented orally. Okay, so when the teacher's reading a book or they're talking, our students should be able to ask and answer those basic questions. And then I also want to kind of see, okay, once they have done some of that listening, what else do they need to be able to do in terms of that presentation or that oral language? So in first grade, we can see that they should be able to describe people, places, and things and events with important details while expressing their ideas clearly. So we want it to be organized. And so with those standards in mind, with those criteria, those skills, I'm going to start thinking about how do I assess those skills in my students. We know that those are getting at those oral language skills, those narrative skills. If we look ahead to second grade, we can then see we want them to be telling a story of recounting those details. So I'm starting to think about how could I assess that with my students? What tools do I already have, do I already use to assess this? One tool that I have used in the past to assess my students' language, more of that narrative language, especially at those younger grades, is the Cubed from the Language Dynamics group. Now again, this tool is freely available online. You go directly to their website and you can download a copy of it. And it is a criterion referenced assessment, and it can also be viewed from a norm reference lens as well. And so this would be a tool that I would use where you read that story aloud and then you have your student retell that story, and they have a nice rubric for you to score those narrative retell elements. You can then look at that overall episode complexity and even ask some questions and get some vocabulary information as well. So it's kind of a nice assessment to really look at that language kind of across the board from that oral language perspective. And then, like I said, that Cubed can be utilized as a criterion referenced assessment. So when you review that manual, you'll see that they have an appendix you can go to kind of see the benchmark. Where do we expect that child to be? So what's nice is we have that standard expectation from the Wisconsin Academic Standards for first grade, and then we can also get some criterion reference cut points here from the Cubed and all the work that they've done in putting this criterion referenced assessment together. So again, in my learning log, I'm going to copy over those standards that I had mentioned previously, and then I'm going to do some reflection upon how I have this tool, the Cube, that provides some really great information for my students' oral language abilities. So in my speech sound example and my language examples, I chose standards that resonated with me and based on students that I serve. So we want you to reflect on tools that you use, that you have access to, and try to make some of those connections to the standards. Maybe you already knew that you were assessing standards with certain tools that you commonly use. Or maybe you gain a new perspective that here are some tools that I commonly use. Oh, they do relate to the standards, and now you can reference those standards as part of your criterion referenced assessments. Or maybe you realize you don't have a lot of great tools and you don't find them very useful. So go ahead and reflect upon, it would be really nice if I had a tool like this, and describe it a little bit. So as you review the standards and choose 1 to 2 standards that you really connect with, feel free to use the standard examples that I provided, especially if this is new for you or overwhelming or maybe feels a bit uncomfortable. And then reflect on some tools that you use and try to make some connections between those tools and the standards and how they could help you maybe assess that progress towards those standards, or how you might need some support in finding more useful tools. If you have a great system in place where you're pairing high quality criterion referenced assessments with the standards, we would love to learn more about it from you. We know from talking with district leadership teams that there are inconsistencies in this area, so your colleagues as well as us would love to hear what you're doing. So feel free to email me any resources that maybe you're willing to share so that we can start to build a set of criterion referenced assessment resources that all SLPs might benefit from. One final reminder, if you haven't already, please fill out that module completion survey. And if you have any questions or need support, please reach out. And we hope that you have a good rest of your day.